It is October, and millions of children will be going through the annual tradition of going to the local pumpkin patch in order to choose the orange orb that they and their families will carve into jack-o'-lanterns. It is not a small business. According to Statista, Americans spent nearly $708 million on pumpkins for jack-o'-lanterns in 2021, leaving, according to the Columbia, Missouri Daily Tribune, nearly 1.5 billion pounds of carved pumpkins rotting on people's front porches. But where did such a strange tradition begin, and how long has it been going on? It's not an easy question. It dates back to ancient traditions, mystic spirits, and strange natural phenomena and literary traditions. All of it history that deserves to be remembered. Samhain is an ancient Celtic seasonal festival that aligned with the arrival of winter, halfway between the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice. The age of the celebration is unclear, although it is mentioned in Irish literature as far back as the 9th century. There are burial mounds in Ireland dating to the Neolithic period that are aligned with the sunrise on the arrival of Samhain, suggesting that some sort of festival might date back to prehistory. While Samhain is a harvest festival, a period when, for example, animals unlikely to make it through the winter would be slaughtered and eaten at a communal feast, it also has a special relationship with the dead, perhaps because of the symbolism of the changing season, with winter being the season of the dead. Samhain is seen as a period when the veil between worlds is thin, offering greater opportunity for spirits, fairies, and ghosts to come into our world. There are many traditions associated with Samhain across Ireland, Scotland, and parts of England, and many of those traditions have influenced the modern celebration of Halloween. Among them, the wearing of costumes and the giving of candy or treats. And so, not surprisingly, the carved Halloween jack-o'-lantern is generally seen as being derived from a Samhain tradition. The idea is generally tied to a character of Irish folktales called Stingy Jack. There are various stories, but the gist is that Stingy Jack, described in an 1836 edition of the Dublin Penny Journal as known throughout the country for his unsocial manners, his blazing hearth never cheered the wayworn stranger, and the repulsed beggar never again sought his inhospitable door. The journal says that Jack became a byword, that is, Stingy Jack was a term used for any inhospitable person. But in the various stories, Jack devises ways to trick the devil himself, by, for example, convincing him to climb a tree to get its fruit and then carving a cross on the tree, preventing the devil from climbing down, and extorts from the devil a promise never to take his soul in exchange for releasing him. But Jack also manages to offend God, either simply by being unworthy because of his trickery, or in some cases offending an angel with his stinginess. So when Stingy Jack dies, the story goes, he's not allowed to either enter heaven nor hell, but doomed to walk the earth, provided by the devil with a single burning coal to light his way. That coal is the jack-o'-lantern. As a Samhain tradition in Ireland, Jack's lantern was represented by carving a ghastly face into a root vegetable, a large potato or turnip, often hollowed out with a small candle placed inside. The jack-o'-lantern is then imagined to ward off evil spirits. A 2005 edition of BBC News writes, "In Ireland, people cut out heads and faces of turnips and hid them in the hedgerows as a prank during Halloween, and they would have carried the tradition over to America. But when they arrived in the New World, they just could not find any turnips, so they used pumpkins instead." The BBC article goes on to lament that the American tradition of using pumpkins has somehow come back to Ireland, reducing the market for turnips. The story of Stingy Jack is somewhat ironic given the way that jack-o'-lanterns are used as part of Halloween tradition today. Here's this symbol of a man who was so stingy that he wouldn't entertain travelers being used as a welcome sign for children who are seeking free candy. But while that is the most common story told to explain the tradition of the jack-o'-lantern, the story is somewhat more complex than that. For example, it isn't clear when the carving of turnips actually began. Some only date the idea back to the 19th century, meaning that the tradition in Ireland is hardly older than the one in America. However, it may be much older. A 2020 edition of National Geographic quotes Nathan Mannion, senior curator for the Irish Immigration Museum in Dublin, that carving round fruits and vegetables to depict a human face goes back thousands of years. It may even have pre-Christian origins that evolved from the custom of head veneration, or potentially even represented war trophies taken from your foes. It is quite macabre, but it may have symbolized the severed heads of your enemies. That is, the carved turnips might, like the harvest festival of Samhain, date back to prehistory. And the practice wasn't just limited to Samhain or Halloween. For example, the strange New England anti-Catholic celebration called Pope Night, practiced from the 1620s all the way into the 1890s, included effigies of the Pope and the Devil, whose heads were often carved from large potatoes. And the exact point when pumpkins became involved is unclear as well. In her book Pumpkin, The Curious History of an American Icon, author Cindy Ott references an illustration in a November 1867 edition of Harper's Weekly entitled The Pumpkin Effigy, and argues that before this time, the jack-o'-lantern, both in the guise of a devilish Irish folk character and an African-American spook, had nothing to do with pumpkin. But it actually might go farther back than that. For example, an 1893 edition of the Uttoxeter New Era and General Advertiser of Staffordshire, UK, quotes an American correspondent about a story from 200 years before. In the story, 14-year-old twin sisters Prudence and Endurance Place were left at home in their rural cabin in a clearing to watch the farm while their parents took their younger siblings on a visit to Portsmouth. During the first day of their homekeeping, the girls gathered the big yellow pumpkins from the field and laid them in a pile near the back door. And while resting from their labor, they, quote, amused themselves by cutting 2 hideous jack-o'-lanterns from large pumpkins, each seeking to outdo the other in carving the grotesque features. They stuck them on poles, fixed the candles inside, and made ready to astonish their father on his return by showing the grinning ogres at the window. He would have known what they were, for he had taught them to make jack-o'-lanterns. Later, however, while collecting a wayward cow, one of the girls overhears some Native Americans. They are aware that the girls had been left alone and plan to raid the farm that evening. The 2 girls hid in some bushes, and when they heard the men in the garden, the candles were lighted in the jack-o'-lanterns, and they were thrust up through the bush. And the Indians caught a glimpse of the frightful faces and, filled with superstitious terror, fled, believing that they had been devils. It's difficult to determine the veracity of story that was supposed to have happened 2 centuries earlier, but the story implies that jack-o'-lanterns carved from pumpkins were well known in the U.S. in the earliest days of the Plymouth colony. And that story is not impossible. Pumpkins, a type of winter squash, were a staple food for Native Americans and introduced to the Plymouth settlers upon their arrival in 1620. And stingy Jack aside, pumpkins are just naturally carvable. The History Channel website notes that the earliest version of pumpkin pie might have been eaten at the first Thanksgiving in 1621, although the Pilgrims would not yet have had butter and flour. According to some accounts, early English settlers in North America improvised by hollowing out pumpkins, filling the shells with milk, honey, and spices to make a custard, and then roasting the gourds whole in hot ashes. Aside from finding the early origin of the pumpkin spice craze, if settlers were hollowing out pumpkins, it isn't a giant leap to think that they may have carved faces in them, especially given, as National Geographic already noted, that using round fruits and vegetables to represent heads goes back to prehistory. The story also illustrates the possibility that jack-o'-lanterns were not always tied to Halloween. An 1895 edition of the New York Times, for example, includes an old-fashioned jack-o'-lantern made from a small pumpkin as part of a Thanksgiving celebration. In any case, National Geographic notes Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, first published in 1820 and republished in 1858, propelled the pumpkin into American culture like never before. While not technically described in the story as a carved jack-o'-lantern, in Ichabod Crane's famous chase with the headless specter, he looks back and just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash and was tumbled headlong into the dust. In the search for the missing schoolmaster the following morning, the hurled head turns out to be a shattered pumpkin. Many depictions since suggest the pumpkin had been carved, including the illustration in the 1864 edition of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And that depiction was even more firmly set in American literature in 1852 with Nathaniel Hawthorne's story Feathertop, in which an old dame, apparently a witch, makes a scarecrow named Feathertop from a body made from her broomstick and other sundry items, but whose head was admirably supplied by a somewhat withered and shriveled pumpkin, in which Mother Rigby cut 2 holes for the eyes and a slit for the mouth, leaving a bluish-colored knob in the middle to pass for its nose. It was really quite a respectable face. The witch enchants the scarecrow to look like a man so long as he smokes a magic pipe. She is disappointed when the ruse is revealed by a mirror. My poor, dear, pretty Feathertop, there are thousands upon thousands of coxcombs and charlatans in the world, made up of just such jumble of worn-out, forgotten, and good-for-nothing trash as he was, yet they live in fair repute and never see themselves for what they are, And why should my poor puppet be the only one to know himself and perish for it? Hawthorne's use of the carved pumpkin to represent a charlatan who is not as they appear is interesting because that is actually more the traditional use of the term jack-o'-lantern. Jack-o'-lanterns were often used as an analogy in 18th and 19th century newspapers for something that leads someone astray. A political party might be said to be distracted by a jack-o'-lantern, leading them in the wrong direction. And a woman might be called a jack-o'-lantern if she leads a young man astray. And in these examples, the term jack-o'-lantern is commonly used synonymously with another phantasm, will-o'-the-wisps. These ghostly lights appeared like flickering lanterns that would be seen by travelers at night and might easily mislead them into swamps or marshes where they would be lost. While descriptions of such lights are common in folk tales around the world, the phenomena is very real and has proven a hazard. While not universally accepted, the general idea is that the phenomena is the result of the interaction of methane gas and lightning. Such lights have been called jack-o'-lanterns at least since the mid-17th century. The website Today I Found Out posits that this name likely originally derived from the practice of calling men generically Dick, Jack, Tom, etc. In particular, men who were lower class were often called generically Jack, beginning around the 14th century in England. Thus, when you see someone carrying a lantern in a distance at night that you see is a man, but you can't make out exactly who it is, he is literally man with a lantern. It isn't difficult to make the connection between these ghostly swamp lights and the flickering light within a carved fruit or vegetable. This suggests an intriguing possibility. Was the jack-o'-lantern really inspired by the Irish folktale of Stingy Jack? Or might the tale of the wandering soul and his burning coal have been inspired by the swamp gas phenomenon already called jack-o'-lanterns? The prospect of jack-o'-lanterns being inspired by methane and swamp gas is somewhat of an irony, as the Columbia Daily Tribune suggests composting them rather than throwing them in landfill because, they note, when something rots in a landfill, methane is released. Interestingly, these lights are also called hob lights. Hobs are small mythical household spirits, and they offer a different meaning for jack-o'-lantern as well. Hobs can be mischievous, but they are not necessarily evil spirits. For example, in Switzerland, hobs are called Jack of the Bowl, a type of house spirit that is helpful. For example, leading your cattle to the best places to graze in exchange for an offering of a bowl of sweet cream left out at night. And in Cornish folklore, Jack of the Lantern is the king of the pixies, husband of Joan of the Wad, Wad being a torch. Either may represent a benevolent fairy who will light your way to safety and provide good luck. A folk rhyme goes, Jack the Lantern, Joan the Wad, that tickled the maid and made her mad. Light me home, the weather's bad. And in fact, a jack-o'-lantern could simply mean a literal lantern, as Mannion noted in National Geographic. A practical purpose also evolved. Metal lanterns were quite expensive, so people would hollow out root vegetables. And over time, people started to carve faces and designs to allow light to shine through the holes without extinguishing the ember. That is the premise of the West Country celebration called Punky Night, celebrated the last Thursday in October in the Somerset village of Hinton St. George. The website Monstrous explains, the story goes that wives of Hinton St. George went looking for their wayward husbands at the fair held nearby at Chiselborough last Thursday in October, but first hollowed out mangel-wurzels in order to make lanterns to light the way. Those lanterns are now represented by children carrying jack-o'-lanterns, although by tradition they are made from hollowed-out mangel-wurzels, a type of beet, but more recently have been made from pumpkins as well. In fact, the name Punky Night has nothing to do with pumpkins. Punk is a Gaelic word for a spark or tinder, and thus a punky is a lantern. And so this very strange tradition has a very complex origin. Is it a light to lead you astray or a light to lead your way home? Is the jack-o'-lantern a representation of an evil spirit or does it protect you from them? Was this idea of shoving a candle inside a squash derived from folk tales, or might the folk tales have been derived from the squash or turnip or mangel-wurzel? Or did it all start with swamp gas? Coming from Illinois, the world's largest producer of pumpkins, I'm happy to see the tradition is being derived from all of the above, as well as, of course, a sign that your house welcomes trick-or-treaters. Harry Houdini died at 1:26 p.m. on October 31st, 1926, in room 401 of Detroit's Grace Hospital. The cause of death was peritonitis, which is an infection of the peritoneum, which is the membrane that surrounds the abdominal cavity. Today, such infections are treated with antibiotics, but in 1926, no such drugs were available. The cause of the infection was a ruptured appendix, which is a common cause of peritonitis. The appendix ruptures because of something called appendicitis, which is an inflammation of the tiny finger-shaped tube that hangs on the end of your large intestine. It's a common illness. According to WebMD, some 1 in 20 Americans can expect to suffer from an appendicitis over their lifetime, and it can be quite deadly. According to the reference book Merck Manual, about 50% of people who suffer from an appendicitis will die if they don't receive either emergency surgery or antibiotics. According to the Bureau of Statistics mortality statistics for 1926, some 15,000 Americans died of appendicitis. And yet the death of this magician from an apparently mundane source still somehow turned out to be controversial and mysterious. The departure of one of the world's most well-known magicians on Halloween 1926 is history that deserves to be remembered. The controversy over Houdini's death is inextricably linked with the controversy that was one of the great causes during his life: anti-spiritualism. Spiritualism is a religious movement based on the belief that the spirits of the dead exist and have both the ability and the inclination to communicate with the living. The movement began in upstate New York in the 1840s and slowly grew into both a religious and a social movement, as well as a profitable form of entertainment. The movement gained strength during the U.S. Civil War, as the deaths of so many soldiers led families to seek solace in attempts to communicate with the dead. Among those seeking such solace were reportedly President and Mrs. Lincoln, who held seances in the White House following the death of their son Willie of a fever in 1862. By the late 19th century, it's estimated that there were as many as 8 million believers in spiritualism in the United States and Europe. The movement would expand again in Houdini's time as a response to the massive casualties of the First World War. But spiritualism always had its skeptics, creating this conflict between people who were willing to debunk the actions of the spiritualists and those who made their living claiming to talk to the dead. It's not really clear when Harry Houdini decided to become an anti-spiritualist, but eventually he would become one of the most famous people who was seeking to discredit the movement. There is a popular belief that suggests that Houdini turned against the spiritualist movement after seeking the help of spiritualists following the death of his mother in 1913. Being a magician, the story goes, Harry recognized the spiritualist tricks and decided to bring the fraud to light. However, not only is there no record of Houdini actually attending seances following his mother's death, evidence has come to light showing that he was opposing and working to expose mediums long before his mother's death. Writing on a website called Skeptic Blog in 2013, author Daniel Loxton noted a story told by a fellow magician and friend of Houdini's, Joseph Wren. According to Wren, in 1896, he and Houdini had published an anonymous letter in the New York Mercury that read, "As I frequently attend spiritualist seances, where materialized spirits are said to come out of a cabinet, I wonder if I would be breaking any law if I fired a pistol shot at one of these figures and a dead body was found on the floor." As a result, Wren said, for fully 6 months, no medium advertised that he was giving materializing seances for fear some fanatic might be tempted to fire a shot at the cabinet spirit. Wren was recalling the event in 1946, and Loxton was unable to locate the original publication of the letter, but the story suggests that Houdini had rejected and was actively opposing spiritualism long before the death of his mother. If her death did affect him, it was likely not from his attending seances thereafter, but his realization that the desperation of grief makes a person an easy target for hucksters. In the introduction to his 1924 book, A Magician Among Spirits, chronicling his exploits debunking various spiritualists, Houdini noted that, as a young magician, he had dabbled in using tricks to dupe people into thinking they were communicating with the dead. However, he wrote, "When I personally became afflicted with similar grief, I was chagrined that I should ever have been guilty of such frivolity, and for the first time realized that it bordered on crime. I would have parted gladly with a large share of my earthly possessions for the solace of one word from my loved departed." So it appears that Houdini was always a skeptic, but it was through his own loss that he decided to make a cause of investigating the spiritualists, an investigation that led him to conclude that, after 25 years of ardent research and endeavor, I declare that nothing has been revealed to convince me that intercommunication has been established between spirits of the departed and those still in the flesh. Harry Houdini was perhaps more responsible than any other person in the decline in the belief in spiritualism. It was a position that put him at odds with a famous contemporary, Arthur Conan Doyle, the author who created Sherlock Holmes and who was a great believer in spiritualism. Screenwriter and Houdini enthusiast John Cox speculated in his blog Wild About Harry that it might have been this competition with the famous author and the attention that it brought that was the true driving force behind Houdini's obsession with debunking spiritualists. In any case, Houdini's assault on mediums would reach its height and make its possible connection to his death in February 1926, when Houdini went to testify before Congress regarding legislation to ban fortune-telling in the District of Columbia. Houdini was combative in the testimony, and having sent a compatriot to infiltrate the D.C. seance scene, revealed the names of prominent politicians who were consulting psychics over matters of state. The climax of his argument came when he pulled out an envelope with $10,000 and offered to any of the various spiritualists who had attended the hearing who could prove their psychic powers. The offer led to an argument with Marcia Champney, who, under the name Madame Marcia, had famously been the psychic advisor to the late President Harding's wife, Florence, and claimed to have predicted the president's untimely death. The argument led Madame Marcia to predict another untimely death, saying that Houdini would be dead by November. And thus it seems suspicious to many when Houdini died rather suddenly on October 31st. Could the appendicitis have really been a murder? The series of events leading to Houdini's death started October 11th. A piece of equipment, a heavy chain, struck him during a performance of his famous Chinese water torture cell trick in Albany, New York, breaking his ankle. He managed to complete the trick, but while in pain, Houdini decided to continue his tour. While injuries were common for the famously fit 52-year-old given his profession, in fact he had had several brushes with death during his career, the broken ankle would lead to an odd turn of events. On October 22nd, Houdini was in Montreal, where he gave a lecture about spiritualism and fraud at McGill University and performed a show. He had invited some of the McGill students to visit him in his dressing room at the Princess Theatre on St. Catherine Street, just east of Phillips Square, before a show. One of the students was an artist and was sketching Houdini in preparation for a portrait while he chatted with other students. Because of his broken ankle, Houdini was reclining on a couch. At some point, the discussion turned to Harry's physical strength, and one of the students, an athlete named Jocelyn Gordon Whitehead, asked him if his stomach could, as Houdini often bragged, withstand the mightiest punch. Houdini said it could, and Whitehead tested him by, as a witness later recalled, giving Houdini some very hammer-like blows below the belt. Houdini was reclining on a couch at the time and looked as though he was in extreme pain and winced as each blow was struck. Houdini was in obvious pain and yet refused to go to a doctor and went on with the show. By evening he was complaining of stomach cramps, took a train to Detroit, where his next performance was to be held, but was in enough pain to telegraph ahead for a doctor. The doctor found that Harry had a fever and suspected that he had appendicitis. The doctor wanted Houdini to have surgery immediately, but the evening show had sold $15,000 in tickets, and Houdini was determined to do the opening night, reportedly saying to the doctor, "I'll do the show, if it is my last." He called off the show before the third act, and by some accounts passed out. A hotel doctor was called at the insistence of his wife, and he was finally convinced to go to the hospital. Houdini underwent emergency surgery to remove his appendix, but it was too late. The appendix had already burst. As the appendix is essentially a repository for bacteria, a ruptured appendix very often causes infection. In 1926, before the advent of antibiotics, peritonitis had a mortality rate of 80%. Despite the best care available at the time, after hanging on for a few days, Houdini was eventually overcome by sepsis. According to his wife, his dying words were, "I'm tired of fighting. I do not want to fight anymore." It was October 31st, and Harry Houdini was, as Madame Marcia had predicted, dead before November. But was his death, as it appeared, just the result of a common appendicitis? Immediately suspicion fell upon the events of November 22nd. Could the punches have caused the appendix to rupture? The evidence was strong enough that Houdini's life insurance company, based on the testimony of two students who had been there that night, declared that the punches had caused the appendix to rupture, and thus the death was an accident as opposed to an illness, causing it to pay out to his wife a double indemnity. The account was accepted at the time, and it became common knowledge that Harry Houdini had been killed after taking blows to the stomach. But was that really the case? In general, appendicitis is caused by a blockage of the intestine, not by blows to the stomach. A 2010 study published in the Annals of the Royal College of Surgeons of England determined that while it is possible for an appendix to rupture due to blunt force trauma, it is very uncommon. A review of literature identified only 28 cases of acute appendicitis caused by blunt abdominal trauma between 1991 and 2009. However, in 2015, engineers at Altair, a company that uses advanced simulation technology, used software designed to model the human body, enabling the simulation of pressure wave propagation inside the body. The software, designed by a French company, is used to aid in the design of personal protections for many kinds of threats, like punches, falls, ballistics, and explosions. Doing multiple tests based on different kinds of punches, the software determined that a punch was unlikely to rupture the appendix of a healthy male who was standing, where the entire body could move backwards to absorb the flex of the punch. However, Houdini was reclining, reducing his ability to dissipate the force. In the 2010 study, it was found that the appendix was more prone to rupture if the person had an appendiclith, a small stone that forms in some people's appendix. The simulation concluded that had the blow landed in the right place, and had Houdini had an appendiclith, it could have caused the appendix to deform or rupture. Thus, it is possible, although far from proven, that Whitehead's blows caused Houdini's appendicitis and eventual death. Given the details found, the broken ankle becomes important. Were it not for the broken ankle, Houdini almost certainly would have stood up for the test, making it nearly impossible to deliver a blow with enough force to cause the appendix to rupture. And that brings Whitehead into the spotlight. Almost nothing is known about him. The accounts from the night vary, not just in the details of how he threw his punches. By some accounts, Whitehead did not give Houdini time to prepare. By others, Houdini had given permission, but said that Whitehead struck more quickly than he expected. But there were other questions as well. Witnesses contradicted each other as to when Whitehead arrived and with whom. It wasn't even clear that he was an actual student at McGill. Could he have been hired by some spiritualist, angry at Houdini's crusade against them? Had he been the victim of murder? Little is known about Whitehead. He apparently largely disappeared after the night he punched Houdini. Investigative journalist Don Bell spent years tracking down the enigmatic man's history, publishing his findings in a 2005 book called The Man Who Killed Houdini. Whitehead turned out to live a troubled life, potentially including mental health disorders and substance abuse, but no clear connection to spiritualists could be made, and if his blows were deliberately intended to harm Houdini, there was no evidence to prove it, nor did he apparently ever offer a motive for doing so, taking such secrets to his grave when he died in 1954. And so the death of Harry Houdini is still a mystery. Most historians assume that the appendicitis was normal and that he only died because he took so long to seek treatment. The blows that he took on November 22nd probably didn't cause his appendix to rupture. If they had any impact at all, it might have been to confuse him as to the cause of his stomach cramps and thus caused him to delay seeking treatment. But those simulations, as well as medical experience, suggest that it's at least plausible that those punches could have been what caused his appendix to rupture and thus caused his death. And if that's true, it's not really clear whether Whitehead intended for that to happen or whether it was merely an accident. And if he intended for it to happen, it's not really clear what his motive might have been or if someone else might have been involved. There's no real evidence that the spiritualists that hated Houdini, like Madame Marcia, took some sort of step to ensure that he did not live to see November. But the possibility cannot be entirely discounted. And there's another possibility as well. In 2007, the Associated Press reported that some descendants of Houdini were seeking to have the body exhumed and tested for poisons, something which wasn't done at the time because the assumption was that he had died of peritonitis. But they didn't apparently fill out any legal paperwork to have that happen, and it's not really clear what the status of that request is. But of course, there is someone who might know, Harry Houdini. To prove that he was open-minded about the possibility of the dead contacting the living, he made an agreement with his wife Bess that he would do his best after death to come back and reach out to her. She held a seance every Sunday for the year after his death, and annually thereafter on Halloween, waiting for him to come back with the code words that they had agreed upon to prove that it was truly Harry Houdini. After 10 years and at least one hoax, she gave up, telling the press that 10 years is long enough to wait for any man. Spiritualists were undeterred by his absence, though. They said that Houdini's ghost is merely being stubborn. Bess passed away in 1943, and the death of Houdini on Halloween remains a mystery, forgotten history to everyone but stubborn ghosts. It is the Halloween season, and families in the United States and many other countries are spending a lot of time thinking about candy. From chocolate to suckers to gumdrops, there's all sorts of different kinds of candy, and everybody has their favorite, but some candy seems to strike a stronger reaction than others. In fact, some are so divisive that everyone seems to have an opinion on them, whether they love them or they hate them. Black licorice, circus peanuts, and candy corn are perhaps the most divisive of the Halloween candies, yet each of them has their own history that has allowed them to, perhaps surprisingly, survive as a Halloween treat for generations. And the history of these hated candies deserves to be remembered. Black licorice flavor comes from a plant, a legume which is widely distributed in Central and Western Asia, Europe, and North Africa. Specifically, it comes from the plant's root, which has a sweetness 30 to 50 times greater than sucrose. The word licorice comes from a corruption of the original Greek term and means sweet root. The root has been ingested in various forms for millennia, and the earliest reference to it or a similar plant comes from 4,300 years ago in the writings of a Chinese emperor known to experiment with plant remedies. The Chinese writings say it could be used as an antidote to toxins, to reduce pain, and as a cure for various other complaints. Numerous ancient cultures used and even cultivated the plant, and its use spread throughout Asia and into Europe. Usually the root would be used to make a drink, and it was primarily used medicinally. Greek physician Hippocrates extolled its uses in the 5th century BC, and licorice root drinks were served to ancient Egyptians, Indian Brahmins, and Assyrians. Greek philosopher Theophrastus called it Scythian root, writing that it could quench thirst and that with its help, the Scythians reportedly could go 11 or 12 days without drinking. Roman sources also spoke of the root's medicinal qualities, and it is mentioned in the writings of Pliny the Elder and the pharmacologist Dioscorides de Materia Medica as a cure for asthma, malaises of the throat, and even sterility. It was known throughout the medieval world as an herbal medicine. Descriptions of the root spread in translations and books kept by monks, and licorice plants seem to have come to Europe in waves as crusaders found the plant in the Middle East. Its cultivation spread throughout northern Europe, and around the 11th century it made its way to England, particularly around Pontefract in Yorkshire, although it's possible licorice plants had grown in the country much earlier than that. In Germany and elsewhere, it was added to beer and was soon used as a flavor additive in cake and bread. In the Middle East and the Mediterranean, licorice was combined with honey into lozenges as a medicine for sore throat, but by then also as a kind of sweet. As sugar became more widely available, it replaced the honey. By the time Queen Elizabeth I was crowned in 1558, Pontefract had become known for its licorice. The roots needed considerable space to grow and flourished in the local deep sandy soil. By 1614, it was being formed into lozenges and stamped with a GS as medicine in small cakes, probably dissolvable and used to make licorice water. Pontefract is often considered the birthplace of licorice as a confection, thanks to the efforts of George Dunhill. Dunhills have been living in Pontefract and growing licorice since at least 1720. George Dunhill was an apothecary, and around 1760 is said to have added sugar to the black licorice lozenges, which became soft, chewable, and non-medicinal candies. He's not the only one with a claim to inventing the sweet. In Italy, Giorgio Armarelli is credited with extracting juice from the licorice root and using it to make sweetened candies in 1731. Licorice flavor became popular, too, in the Netherlands, where it is called drop. Netherlands generally leads the world in licorice consumption, and sweet shops in Amsterdam claim to have been selling licorice sweets since 1743. It was probably in the Netherlands where it began being extruded, creating the classic twisted ropes we know today. In the Netherlands, Germany, and Nordic countries, licorice is a perennial favorite in a huge number of varieties, especially in the even more divisive form of salty licorice, where black licorice is combined with ammonium chloride. As ammonium chloride is known to be an expectorant, it's possible it was combined with black licorice as medicine for respiratory problems before it became a treat. It was popular across the continent in many forms. Napoleon was a particular fan, and he carried sticks to chew to help settle his stomach. It's been suggested that his love of licorice even turned his teeth black, and that he imbibed licorice drink almost exclusively in his final days. The 19th century saw an explosion of sweet production, and at least 13 factories produced many thousands of black licorice sweets every day in Pontefract. Thousands of workers, often women, stamped the cakes with an image of the castle. Globalization and industrialization eventually swallowed up most of these companies, and the growing of licorice faded as it became cheaper to import flavoring from the Mediterranean and Turkey. A September 2017 edition of Garden Illustrated notes that, anecdotally, the death knell for the cultivation of licorice root in Pontefract was when American GIs introduced the British to chocolate candy during the Second World War. In the United States, licorice companies existed at least since 1845, and later introduced more flavors, such as cherry and raspberry twist ropes like Red Vine and Twizzlers. These products have come to be called licorice and red licorice because it was the same shape, and created the term black licorice to refer to traditional licorice-flavored candies. Licorice flavoring is often used in tobacco products in America, where it covers up the taste of nicotine. Around 1900, licorice all sorts arrived, manufactured by British company Bassett's, combined with sugar, coconut, jelly, and more. All sorts are popular throughout the world, but especially in Great Britain and the Netherlands. Licorice-flavored Good and Plenty, possibly the oldest branded candy in the United States, was first produced in 1893. But despite its history, the candy is notably polarizing. A February 2018 edition of the Washington Post writes, "There is not much data to measure the popularity of licorice, but anecdotally, it seems to be one of the most polarizing flavors. Some have called it the devil in candy form." BuzzFeed once published a quiz called "We Know If You Like Black Licorice" with just one question, and it was a yes or no question. Are you 80 years old? The Post notes that a survey by the National Confectioners Association found that only 3% of people said that licorice was a favorite candy when they were a child, and that on a 538 ranking of 86 candies, Good and Plenty came in dead last. Yet black licorice soldiers on. Last August, the website Zippia used Google Trends to examine 50 different popular candies and how often each one is searched for within the United States to determine the most popular Halloween candy in each state. Astoundingly, black licorice came out as the most popular Halloween candy in Colorado. And the flavor remains popular globally, not just in candies, but in beers and alcohol, such as Jägermeister, Sambuca, and Ouzo. Licorice flavoring is even present in NyQuil. Not all licorice flavoring, however, is derived from the licorice root, but from other plants that have similar flavors. For example, in the United States, particularly fennel is often used, as is the seeds from the anise plant, even though neither one is particularly closely related to the licorice root. And in Asia, star anise, which is a fruit from an evergreen tree, is often used, even though it, oddly, is neither closely related to licorice nor to anise. Perhaps just as divisive are the orange, peanut-shaped marshmallow candies called circus peanuts. Steve Almond, who wrote the book Candy Freak, calls them a completely baffling candy. For starters, the exact invention of the candy is unknown. Historians, candy experts, and even the candy makers are unsure where the banana-flavored, peanut-shaped marshmallows come from. A number of companies have been making the product for decades. Candy maker Spangler has been making them since the 1930s and perfected their recipe in 1941, while Wisconsin-based Melster has been making them since 1919. According to Spangler, during World War II, circus peanut slurry was sold as a substitute for sugar due to war rationing. "We've tried to find out why they're called circus peanuts," a spokesperson for Spangler Candy said in a 2003 article in the North Bay Bohemian. "We've asked people in the Spangler family. We've asked historians from Barnum and Bailey Circus, but no one knows. For that matter, no one knows why they're orange or why they're flavored like bananas." Andrew Zimmern, who is a chef, a food critic, and a restaurateur, wrote in his book, Andrew Zimmern's Guide to Exceptionally Weird, Wild, and Wonderful Foods, that rumor has it that the odd choice to make them banana-flavored stuck after a freak banana oil incident. Apparently, the mystery of circus peanuts is a true bit of forgotten history. Sources agree that they appeared in the 1800s and that they were a common sight in penny candy displays. There are references to marshmallow peanuts in candy advertisements at least as early as 1903 and circus peanuts by 1919. And various theories have been put forward for their origins, including that they originated with traveling circuses, but nothing has been conclusively proven. And authors Richard and Anna Kate Hartle suggest in their 2008 book Food Bites, The Science of the Foods We Eat, that the history of circus peanuts is clouded, perhaps because nobody wants to admit that they're responsible for developing this much maligned product. What is clear is that the treat, hated widely across the internet, has an odd and enduring popularity and has served at least 120 years as an apparently uniquely American treat. Owner of candy wholesaler Candy Favorites even calls them not so much candy as Americana. Their association with circuses is as unexplained. Possibly it's only due to their shape and the fact that peanuts were regularly consumed at circuses. Spangler trademarked the term in 1950, but abandoned the trademark in the 1990s. Initially, they were a seasonal candy, usually available in the springtime, and were not widely enjoyed year-round until the 1940s, and plastics technology allowed for the creation of sealed bags. Despite their apparent unpopularity, Spangler alone made nearly 4 million pounds of the candy in 2006, and various flavors, colors, and even seasonal shapes have appeared throughout the years. Like black licorice, marshmallow itself has a long history, dating back to ancient Egypt, when it was made with sap from the mallow plant, commonly found in marshes, likely mixed with honey and nuts, and often used medicinally. It became a popular treat in the 1800s in France, but increasing demand led them to find a new method of making marshmallows using the starch mogul system, where cornstarch could be put into molds and the water and sugar mixes poured in. The traditional mallow was replaced with gelatin, which created a stable product. Circus peanuts are somewhat unique for marshmallows, and their particular texture, harder than regular marshmallows and somewhat gritty, requires particular care. Steve Kerr, a vice president at Spangler, says they are the company's most difficult to make candy because you've got all these variables coming together. Gelatin, sugar, water, and corn syrup are the main ingredients, but the moisture level is most important to achieve that unique texture. While they're often so despised that people seem confused that they even still exist, the Zippia survey found that circus peanuts were the most popular Halloween candy in Oklahoma, and they've had a more popular legacy in the form of breakfast cereal. According to General Mills, John Holohan came up with the idea for Lucky Charms cereal when he chopped up circus peanuts into Cheerios, which led to the creation of Marbits, the tiny marshmallow pieces that are magically delicious. And there is another candy that vies for the title of most divisive or even the most hated candy: candy corn. Like circus peanuts, candy corn's origins date to the 1800s. There is some disagreement, however. It's usually said to have been invented in Philadelphia by German immigrant Philip Wunderlich. In 1865, Wunderlich arrived in the United States and in 1871 began making candy in Philadelphia, and in 1876 was joined by George Renninger. According to Wunderlich's children, Renninger is said to have invented buttercream, or the material for candy corn, in 1888. Renninger's early works were shaped like acorns, turnips, and pumpkins, and the exact genesis of the candy corn is less clear. The National Confectioners Association calls it legend that Renninger invented the candy. Its popularity came later when Golitz Candy, now known as Jelly Belly, began producing them in 1898 or 1900. The Wunderlich story has some convincing evidence, including a patent for a box shaped like a drum invented by Renninger and assigned to Philip Wunderlich, and a small Wunderlich pail advertising the best buttercream corn, owned by historic Shane Confectionery in Philadelphia. Candy corn was not simple to make. Before the days of machines, it required several people pouring large buckets of the colored cream by hand in 3 passes. Likely it was produced only seasonally and required hundreds of people hauling around buckets to pour into cornstarch-lined molds. While it has always resembled a corn kernel, it wasn't always known as candy corn, but instead as chicken feed or chicken corn. Golitz claims it was so successful that it carried them through the Depression and 2 world wars and made up a significant part of their income. It also wasn't originally associated with Halloween. Orange and yellow evoked autumn, and it was meant to represent harvest to a largely agricultural nation in the 1800s, but corn was often not eaten before the arrival of sweeter corn varieties. Advertisements show it was more closely associated with chickens than corn, with slogans like "something worth crowing for" or a rooster dubbed "king of the candy corn fields." It took longer for it to become associated specifically with Halloween, when the bulk of candy is sold today. Trick-or-treating largely grew in popularity after World War II, and at least in the early years, candy companies didn't think of Halloween as a candy holiday. Instead, they focused on Christmas, Easter, and even Washington's birthday. According to the book Candy, A Century of Panic and Pleasure, a 1957 Brock's advertised candy corn as one of their summertime candies, along with circus peanuts. And a 1951 Virginia drugstore advertised candy corn as the candy all children love to nibble on all year long. It was the 1950s that saw Halloween become closely associated with candy and a dramatic spike in October advertising for candy corn. The fall colors and connection to autumn and harvest were already there, and all the sweet, waxy triangles needed was a bit of marketing. But candy corn has its haters. A reviewer on the website The Takeout describes the texture as Satan's earwax. An October 2nd, 2022 edition of USA Today quoted Paul Adams, a senior editor at Cook's Illustrated magazine. "It's just intensely sweet tasting, which can produce palate fatigue, like eating spoonfuls of honey or sugar." The article notes that candy corn is particularly divisive, sparking annual wars on Twitter. A symbol of its divisive nature is represented in the website candystore.com. Ranking by bulk sales, the website says that candy corn is among the top 10 favorite candies in America. But when doing a consumer survey of worst candy, candy corn ranked number 1, just ahead of circus peanuts. While the Zippia method found candy corn to be the most popular Halloween candy in West Virginia, and a 2013 National Confectioners Association survey found that it was the second most favorite candy behind the overwhelming winner of chocolate. But despite the controversy, 35 million pounds of it are produced each year, some 9 billion pieces. October 30th is even National Candy Corn Day. And if you're wondering, National Licorice Day is April 12th, and although circus peanuts don't appear to have their own national day, National Marshmallow Day is August 30th. So why do we keep these candies around for generations, even though they engender such vitriol? Well, I mean, some people seem to legitimately like them, but MAShed offers an argument for why we keep controversial candies around that has nothing to do with taste and texture, saying that some psychologists say that all the hate has nothing to do with candy corn, but it's all about Americans' love of arguing. That is, we keep them around because we like yelling at each other on Twitter. Ouch. I prefer another explanation. Maybe we keep them around because they have such a wonderful history. You could call that nostalgia. You could call that tradition. You could even call that provenance. Or you could simply acknowledge that history deserves to be remembered. Banana. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.